Okay, let's dive in. Think about this. What happens when the world, the one you thought was, well, eternal, suddenly
Yeah, it's
collapses?
a terrifying thought. When empires fall, why do some ideas stick around while entire civilizations just crumble?
Exactly. And that brings us to a specific moment, the year 410 CE. Imagine, the Visigoths are inside the walls of Rome. Not just any city, but the city.
Rome, the eternal city. Its fall was seismic. It wasn't just a military defeat.
No, it shook everything. People's understanding of history, their faith, the destiny of society itself. It raised these huge, profound questions. Questions that, frankly, demanded answers.
And that massive crisis, that shock, became the direct catalyst for, well, arguably one of the most influential works in Western thought. Today, we're doing a deep dive into Augustine of Hippo's City of God.
And this isn't just some dusty old book, right? It's huge. It's complex, what, 22 books?
Yeah.
And written specifically because Rome fell.
Precisely. It's his attempt to build this massive intellectual structure, a whole new way of understanding the world, right in the rubble of that old certainty.
Okay, so for this deep dive, we've looked at different translations, various analyses, trying to get a handle on it. And our mission really is to guide you through its sheer scale. We want to unpack Augustine's arguments, get to grips with his core idea, this vision of two cities.
And explore why it still matters. Why does a book written over 1,600 years ago still challenge how we think about, faith, politics, the human condition?
Yeah, we want to give you those key insights, those aha moments, without you having to wade through all 22 books yourself. A shortcut to being informed on something truly monumental.
So let's paint that picture again. 410 CE. Rome hadn't been breached by a foreign army in, 800 years?
Ah.
Since the Gauls way back in 390 BC.
8 centuries. The idea of eternal Rome wasn't just a slogan, it was baked into their identity. Then Alaric and the Visigoths turn up.
It wasn't complete destruction, more of a thorough sacking, plundering, but the psychological blow, devastating.
It felt like the end of order itself, like the barbarians had captured the symbol of civilization. It just threw everything into question.
And predictably, perhaps, the finger-pointing started almost immediately. You saw this resurgence of traditional pagan arguments.
Ah, the we told you so crowd.
Pretty much. Their line was, this happened because Rome abandoned the old gods, the gods who supposedly protected the city for centuries, who ensured its success. They were angry, turning to Christianity. That's what caused this disaster.
So that's a charge Augustine is facing head-on in City of God.
Absolutely. He doesn't duck it. The early books are a direct, sustained attack on that very argument. He goes right after the claim that worshiping the pagan gods ever actually guaranteed temporal blessings, wealth, power, peace, winning wars.
And he says they didn't.
He says they never did,
Right.
not reliably, not even for their most pious followers. And here's the clever part. He uses Rome's own history, their own heroes, to prove it.
Like the story of Regulus. Marcus Attilius Regulus, that one's grim.
It is grim. A Roman general captured by Carthage. They send him back to Rome to negotiate peace, making him swear an oath by the Roman gods, mind you, to return if he fails.
And he goes back to Rome and argues against the deal, right? Knowing it means his own death sentence.
Exactly, an act of incredible, almost unbelievable civic virtue and loyalty to his oath. The Romans revered him for it. But then, true to his word, he goes back to Carthage.
And they don't treat him well.
That's putting it mildly. The accounts describe horrific torture, shutting him in a box lined with sharp nails, sleep deprivation, agonizing death.
Just awful. And Augustine uses this story, a Roman hero.
Precisely. He basically asks, look, if your gods protect their worshippers and grant earthly happiness, why did this happen to Regulus? He suffered because he kept an oath sworn in their name. Augustine uses it to show these gods offer no guarantee of temporal well-being. If anything, Regulus's fate highlights how unpredictable and often unjust earthly life is, no matter who you worship.
He also brings in Cato the Younger, doesn't he? Contrasting him with Regulus.
Yes, Cato, who famously committed suicide after Caesar won, to avoid living under what he saw as tyranny. Augustine actually finds Regulus's choice to endure suffering and captivity, even if for a pagan oath potentially more virtuous than Cato's suicide.
Why? Because suicide is wrong.
From the Christian perspective Augustine is developing, yes. Suicide is seen as a grave sin, rejecting God's gift of life. Christians, he argues, are called to endure hardship, even captivity, trusting in God's providence, not to take their own lives in despair. So Regulus's endurance, even though not explicitly Christian, points towards a kind of steadfastness that contrasts with Cato's ultimate act.
So it's not just the gods didn't protect Rome, it's also the gods themselves and the worship they demand are questionable.
Absolutely. He goes further. He dissects Roman state religion, what the scholar Varro called civil theology. He looks at the pantheon, the rituals, and finds them, well, inconsistent, irrational, often morally dubious.
Like the whole business with the theater.
Yes. He points out the absurdity. The Romans themselves looked down on actors and playwrights, considered comedy rather disgraceful, even barred actors from holding office.
Right.
Yet the very plays they put on, often funded by the state for religious festivals, depicted the supposed crimes and scandalous behavior of the gods themselves. Jupiter's affairs, divine squabbles. Augustine asks, why would you worship gods whose stories are the stuff of entertainment you find shameful?
It is a bit hypocritical when you put it like that.
He argues it exposes these gods not as divine, but as, his words, detestable devils who actually take pleasure in human failings and degradation. Why would truly good deities demand worship through means the worshippers themselves find base?
And the sheer number of gods for tiny things.
Oh, he has field day with that. He lists them off, gods for getting out of bed, for walking out the door, for coming home, for the baby's first cry, for nursing, for standing up.
It sounds exhausting.
It sounds ridiculous, and that's his point. He argues it shows a fragmented, almost silly view of divine power. If you believe in one true sovereign God who gives all good gifts, including virtue and skill, why would you need dozens of micro-gods for every single action? It highlights the unnecessary clutter of the whole system.
Okay, so he's systematically dismantling the pagan argument, using Roman history, values, and practices against itself. Rome didn't fall because it abandoned its gods. Those gods were never the source of true security or happiness anyway.
That's the defensive thrust, yes. But, and this is crucial, City of God goes so much further than just defending Christianity. It becomes this vast, sweeping reinterpretation of all history, a new theological blueprint for understanding society, and a completely different vision of human destiny.
He wants to shift people's entire focus.
Dramatically. Away from the temporary fortunes of earthly empires like Rome, and towards the eternal perspective, the enduring reality of what he calls the City of God.
Which brings us right to the core metaphor, the title of the work, the two cities.
This is absolutely central. Augustine lays out this fundamental distinction between the earthly city, sometimes called the city of man, and the city of God, the heavenly city.
And crucially, these aren't literal places on a map, right? Not like Rome versus Jerusalem or something.
No, not at all. That's a common misunderstanding. They aren't geographical locations or even necessarily identical with specific institutions like the state versus the church.
They're defined by what they love.
Exactly. That's the absolute key. He says, two loves have made two cities. The earthly city is formed by amor sui usque ad contemptum Dei, the love of self, pushed even to the point of contempt for God.
Its goals are worldly.
Yes. Its ultimate aims are earthly peace, sure, but mainly things like worldly glory, power, domination, material wealth, the comforts and status symbols of this life. Its foundation is self-centered love.
And the city of God.
The city of God is formed by amor Dei usque ad contemptum sui, the love of God, pushed even to the point of contempt for self. Its ultimate aim isn't earthly glory, but the enjoyment of God himself, eternal peace with God, and fellowship with others in God. Its foundation is God-centered love.
So people living side by side could actually belong to different cities depending on this deep internal orientation.
Precisely. Augustine stresses that these two cities are mixed together, intertwined throughout human history, right up to the present day. They coexist. You can't just look at someone and know which city they truly belong to.
It's not obvious.
Not at all. He even suggests that some people visibly inside the church might secretly be enemies of the city of God, driven by self-love, while some apparent outsiders might truly belong to it and will eventually be revealed as citizens.
So it's not a simple equation like church equals city of God, state equals earthly city.
Definitely not that simple. It's much more about the fundamental orientation of the will, the deepest allegiance of the heart. What do you ultimately love? What do you ultimately hope for? Is it rooted in yourself and the things of this world, or in God and the promise of eternity?
But even though they're mixed now, their final destinations are completely opposite.
Fundamentally opposed, yes. The earthly city, with all its ambitions and achievements, is ultimately temporary. It's subject to decay, change, and ruin, Rome's fall being the prime exhibit. The city of God, however, is eternal.
And this idea of the city of God being a pilgrim or stranger here on earth, that seems vital for how its citizens should live now.
It's absolutely key. Citizens of the city of God live in the world, within the structures of the earthly city, but as temporary residents, as pilgrims passing through. Their true home, their ultimate loyalty, is elsewhere.
So they use the world but don't belong to it, in a sense.
That's a good way to put it. This pilgrim status gives them a distinct perspective. They can participate in society, work for the common good, obey laws, benefit from the temporal peace the earthly city provides. Augustine thinks they should. But they hold these things somewhat loosely. Their real security, their ultimate hope, isn't invested in earthly success or structures.
It changes how you view things like power, wealth, status.
It relativizes them entirely. They become tools, maybe temporary goods to be used responsibly, but they are never the ultimate goal. They don't define your true identity or worth. Success or failure in the earthly city isn't the final judgment.
Okay, so having laid out this huge framework, Augustine then turns his attention not just back to pagan religion, but also to, well, philosophy, human wisdom.
Yes, large sections of City of God involve a really deep engagement with ancient philosophy, especially Platonism and Neoplatonism. He shows respect for their intellectual search for truth, but ultimately argues that human reason alone, without God's revelation, falls short.
He talks about their search for the summum bonum, the highest good.
Right, the ultimate goal of life, the thing that brings true happiness, philosophers debated, was it found in bodily pleasure, intellectual virtue, some combination. Augustine actually praises the Platonists here. He thinks they came closest among the pagans.
Why?
Because they located the highest good not just in the mind or body, but in the enjoyment of God. He loved Plato's idea that the goal is life according to virtue, which is only possible if you know God and try to imitate him. Plato even said that to be a philosopher is to love God, and wisdom brings happiness only when one enjoys God.
That sounds quite close to a Christian idea.
It does, and Augustine acknowledges that. He uses this powerful analogy. Just as the eye finds its purpose and pleasure in seeing light, the soul finds its true happiness and fulfillment in knowing and enjoying God.
But he still finds major problems with philosophy.
Oh, absolutely. For instance, he strongly critiques the Neoplatonist ideas about demons acting as intermediaries between the gods and humans. Philosophers like Porphyry discuss practices, sometimes called Theology, aimed at contacting these spirits. Some even suggested there could be good demons helping bridge the gap between the immortal blessed gods and us mortal suffering humans.
And Augustine thought that idea of good demons was flawed.
Logically flawed, yes. He makes an interesting argument. Look at humans, he says. We're intermediate between animals, mortal, irrational, and angels, immortal, rational, because we share mortality with one and rationality with the other. So a true intermediary between blessed immortals, gods, and wretched mortals, us, would need to combine either happiness with mortality or wretchedness with immortality.
Okay.
Since demons were considered immortal, Augustine argues, the only way they could logically be intermediate is if they were wretched, not blessed and happy intermediaries helping us reach the gods. So the whole concept seemed contradictory to him.
He also felt the philosophers were inconsistent about these spirits.
Yes, he points to a letter by Porphyry to an Egyptian priest named Anabo. In it, Porphyry seems quite skeptical about these magical practices, questioning the spirits involved, who seem attracted by things like sacrificial smoke, which Augustine sees as clear signs of fallen, deceitful spirits. Yet, elsewhere, Porphyry still tries to accommodate the idea of benignant or good demons. Augustine finds this confusing and inconsistent, contrasting it sharply with the Christian understanding of demons as fundamentally malevolent fallen angels.
And even when philosophy gets close to truth, it misses the crucial step.
That's his ultimate point. He acknowledges Porphyry saying that true purification from vice and ignorance doesn't come from rituals or just philosophy, but from the Father's mind, the Patrikos Nous. That sounds really close to the idea of divine grace or illumination.
I did.
But, Augustine argues, Porphyry tragically failed to recognize this Father's mind in the person of Jesus Christ. Why? Because of philosophical pride. They couldn't accept the humility of God becoming human, taking on a physical body, suffering and dying on a cross. It seems foolish, lowly, unworthy of the divine.
And he connects this failure directly to Scripture.
Directly, he quotes the Apostle Paul. God chose to destroy the wisdom of the wise. The world, through its own wisdom, its philosophy, failed to truly know God. So God chose a different path. Salvation through the foolishness of preaching Christ crucified, something the intellectually proud might scoff at, but which holds the ultimate truth and power for salvation.
So the takeaway is that human reason, even at its best in philosophy, has limits. It can point towards God, maybe, but can't reach him without revelation and grace. And pagan religion is not just useless, but potentially dangerous, involving deceitful spirits.
That's it, exactly. Human efforts alone are insufficient for ultimate truth and happiness.
This deep sense of human limitation, rooted in his theology of sin, must then shape how he views earthly politics and the state. His view is often called realistic, maybe even pessimistic.
I think realistic is fair, though sometimes it sounds pessimistic, yes. He doesn't have illusions about earthly perfection. He famously asked in Book 4, remove justice and what are kingdoms but great robberies, or gangs of criminals on a large scale?
That's a provocative statement.
It is. It shows his deep skepticism about the possibility of achieving true, perfect justice or lasting peace within any earthly political system. Because these systems are run by and composed of flawed human beings affected by original sin, a perfectly just state on earth. Impossible in this age, in his view.
And he defines a people or a commonwealth not by its government structure, but by something else.
Yes, this is fascinating. He argues that what defines a people isn't whether they have a king or consuls or a democracy. It's about the common objects of their love. A people is a multitude united by a shared agreement about what they cherish, what they pursue together.
So even the Roman Republic, with its virtues.
Even Rome, which he acknowledges had virtues like love of glory, patriotism, civic duty figures like Cato or Caesar, embody this, was ultimately defined by earthly loves. Love of power, love of empire, love of praise. These are their shared objects of affection, making them a people in his sense, but still fundamentally part of the earthly city.
Okay, but if earthly states are inherently flawed and can't achieve perfect justice, does Augustine think they're pointless? Or even illegitimate?
No, not at all. This is really important. Despite the realism, maybe pessimism, he clearly recognizes a legitimate, necessary, God-ordained role for earthly government. It's a provisional role, limited in scope, but vital.
And that role is?
To maintain temporal peace and order. Even within the flawed earthly city, government serves the crucial function of restraining evil, punishing crime, and preserving a basic level of stability that allows people to live their lives. This temporal peace, though fragile and imperfect compared to the eternal peace of God, is a genuine good.
A good that benefits everyone.
Yes, a good that citizens of both cities, the earthly and the heavenly, can share and benefit from during their time on earth. It's necessary for the pilgrims of the city of God, too, as they journey through this world.
He talks about this civil peace as part of a larger concept of order.
He does. He outlines different kinds of peace. Peace of the body, peace within the soul, peace in the home, leading up to civil peace, which he defines as well-ordered concord among citizens. All this fits into his broader idea of peace being the tranquility of order. Even suffering, he argues, fits into God's order if it's justly deserved. Even war, paradoxically, aims at establishing some kind of peace, however flawed, and requires internal order to be waged.
And he uses Rome's own history again, not just its heroes, but its bloody civil wars, to show the inherent instability.
Exactly. He doesn't shy away from the brutal conflicts, like the wars between Marius and Sylla, recounting the massacres and cycles of vengeance described by Roman historians like Cicero and Lucan. These horrific events, happening right within the heart of the supposedly well-ordered republic, demonstrate for Augustine the chaos that inevitably erupts when societies are driven primarily by competing earthly desires for power, revenge, wealth, rather than the unifying love of God.
So, earthly government is necessary, earthly peace is valuable, but we shouldn't expect perfection from it because human nature, tainted by sin, makes that impossible.
That sums it up well. It's a provisional good, pointing beyond itself to the need for the perfect, lasting peace found only in the city of God.
This sense of the provisional, the temporary nature of earthly things fits right into Augustine's whole understanding of history itself, which was apparently quite revolutionary.
Hugely revolutionary for its time. The common view in much of the ancient world was cyclical history repeats. Empires rise and fall in endless cycles. Augustine rejects that entirely. He presents history as linear, teleological.
Meaning it has a purpose, a direction.
Yes, a definite beginning in God's creation, a course directed by God's providence, and a final, ultimate end, the last judgment and the establishment of the eternal state. History is a story moving towards a specific goal set by God.
And God isn't just watching, he's steering.
Actively involved, yes. Augustine insists on God's pervasive sovereign providence guiding all events. And here's a mind-bending part. He argues that even human sin, the wicked choices of people and fallen angels, cannot ultimately derail God's plan.
How does that work?
God is so wise and powerful, Augustine argues, that he can weave even evil actions into his larger tapestry, using them to ultimately achieve his good purposes, often in ways we can't understand, ultimately for the greater glory of his city. He permits temptation not because he's surprised by the outcome, but because he foreknows how it will serve his ultimate design.
And he traces this divine plan mainly through biblical history.
Primarily, yes.
Yeah.
He reinterprets both Roman history and, more centrally, the biblical narrative within this framework of salvation history, the unfolding story of God's redemption. He starts right from Genesis, distinguishing the lineage of Seth, associated with the city of God, from Cain's line, earthly city destined to perish.
He follows the line down through Noah, Shem.
Down to Abraham, the key figure. He gets into details, genealogies, even discusses differences between the Hebrew and Greek Septuagint texts regarding dates, using these to show the deliberate thread of God's promise running through history. He highlights the meaning of names, like Peleg, division, linking it to the scattering of peoples after Babel, an event that creates the divisions the city of God must navigate.
And the promises to Abraham are key, having both earthly and spiritual dimensions.
Exactly. There's the promise of the land of Canaan to Abraham's physical descendants, which Augustine sees fulfilled historically in the kingdom of Israel under David and Solomon. But the far greater promise is to the spiritual descendants that through Abraham, all nations would be blessed. This points directly to Christ.
He rereads Old Testament stories through this lens.
Absolutely. Abraham telling Sarah to say she's his sister in Egypt. Augustine interprets it complexly, not just as a lie, but maybe as an act of faith, trusting God to protect her. The near sacrifice of Isaac becomes profoundly Christological. Abraham's faith foreshadows belief in the resurrection. Isaac carrying the wood mirrors Christ carrying the cross. The ram caught in the thicket, offered instead of Isaac, becomes a powerful symbol, a similitude of Christ's substitutionary sacrifice.
He then follows Israel's history judges, kings, the split kingdom, the captivities.
Yes, tracing the often rocky path of God's chosen people leading up to the time of the prophets. And he makes a fascinating point about timing. He notes that many major writing prophets, Isaiah, Amos, Micah, Joel, appear roughly around the time the Assyrian Empire is fading, and crucially, the Roman kingdom is beginning.
He sees that timing as significant.
Very significant. He suggests God intended prophecy about salvation extending to all nations to be recorded just as Rome, the empire destined to rule many nations, was rising. It prepares the historical stage for Christ, who fulfills the promise that all nations will be blessed through Abraham's seed. He rounds off this historical sweep, quoting Malachi, the last Old Testament prophet, who speaks of the final distinction between the righteous and wicked, the coming judgment, and the rising of the Son of Righteousness, which Augustine identifies clearly as Christ.
So history isn't random or cyclical. It's God's purposeful narrative moving towards the final victory of the city of God.
That's the vision. God's plan unfolding, using everything, even empires and human sin, to achieve his ultimate end.
And underpinning this entire historical and political vision is Augustine's deep understanding of the human condition itself, especially original sin. He explored that personally in Confessions, but here he applies it universally.
Right. Confessions is the personal journey. City of God takes that theology of sin, grace, and human nature and applies it to the grand scale of history and society.
He even sees physical death as a direct result of sin.
Yes, that's a core argument. Death, the separation of soul and body, wasn't God's original intention for humanity. Adam and Eve were created with the possibility of immortality if they hadn't sinned. By disobeying, they brought death upon themselves, and this state, this punishment, is inherited by all their descendants.
We inherit a fallen nature.
Yes. Humans now produce humans not from pristine dust like Adam, but from their own fallen selves, passing on this corrupted nature. He even suggests the helplessness and weakness of babies reflects this fallen state, this vulnerability to suffering and mortality that wasn't part of the original design.
And he pushes back against the idea, common in some philosophies, that the body is just a prison for the soul and death is a good thing, a liberation.
He does. He argues the problem isn't the body itself, but the corruptibility of the body, which is a consequence of sin. That's what burdens the soul. The corruptible body presseth down the soul, as he quotes. He points out that even Plato depicted the supreme God promising lesser gods immortality in their bodies as a gift, showing that even pagan thought didn't inherently see embodiment as bad if the body was perfect and incorruptible.
Did Adam and Eve feel fear or sadness in paradise before the fall?
Augustine argues no. He calls these negative emotions perturbations, and believes they are incompatible with the state of perfect blessedness they initially enjoyed. Even desiring something forbidden out of fear of punishment rather than pure love of righteousness would already be a kind of falling away. Their original state was one of undisturbed happiness, both mentally and physically.
And this doctrine of original sin, this inherent flaw in human nature, is the ultimate explanation for why earthly societies are always marked by conflict, injustice, and chasing the wrong things.
Exactly. It's the theological root cause. The human will, inclined towards self-love, amor sui, because of sin, inevitably leads to disorder within individuals and consequently within the societies they form. This explains the persistent failure of the earthly city to achieve lasting peace or perfect justice. He does use analogies, though, to argue for God's power to overcome limitations. If humans can make iron float in a ship, surely God can make bodies incorruptible for heaven. It's not the material, but the state God puts it in.
It's a foundational understanding of humanity that shapes his entire view of history and politics. It explains why the earthly city is doomed to fall short.
It grounds his realism theologically.
Okay, so if history is linear, driven by providence but marked by sin, where does it end? What's the final act? This brings us to the eschatology, the ultimate destiny of these two cities.
Right. The linear story reaches its climax in the Last Judgment. This is the final, definitive separation. The two cities, intertwined throughout history, will be sorted into their distinct eternal destinies.
And for the city of God, it's a vision of triumph.
Absolute, glorious, eternal triumph. Its citizens will experience the resurrection of life. He contrasts this sharply with the resurrection of judgment or damnation for those who belong to the earthly city in their deepest love.
He distinguishes between two resurrections.
Yes, he talks about a first resurrection, which is the spiritual rebirth, the renewal a person experiences through God's grace in this life. Then there's the second resurrection, which is the physical, bodily resurrection at the end of time. His point is crucial. Those who participate in the first resurrection, spiritual life now, will not suffer the second death, eternal damnation, after the second bodily resurrection. Not everyone resurrected gets eternal life, only those regenerated by grace.
And what is that eternal life like for the saved? What's the nature of this eternal peace?
He describes it as the ultimate true bliss. It's the perfectly ordered and harmonious enjoyment of God and of one another in God. It's that tranquility of order achieved perfectly, with absolutely no disturbance, no conflict, no loss, no possibility of sinning ever again.
And they'll have bodies. What kind?
Yes, resurrected bodies, but what he calls spiritual bodies. Now, this doesn't mean non-material, like ghosts. It means bodies perfectly animated and controlled by the Holy Spirit, no longer subject to the limitations and corruption of our current animal bodies. Bodies animated by the soul, tied to physical needs and decay. Even Adam's pre-fall body was animal in this sense. The resurrection body is something higher.
So not less real, but more real. Perfected.
Exactly. Incorruptible, immortal, glorious, suited for eternal life in God's presence like Christ's own resurrected body. Through grace, the saved will fully reflect the image of the heavenly man, Christ overcoming the image of the earthy man, Adam, inherited by birth. Salvation, experienced now by hope, culminates then when the natural body becomes this spiritual body.
Knowing this is the ultimate destiny must profoundly shift one's perspective on everything that happens here and now.
It's meant to. This ultimate hope provides the ultimate perspective. All the empires, achievements, struggles, successes, and failures of earthly life are revealed as temporary, fleeting. Compared to the eternal weight of glory, the lasting peace and joy of the city of God, everything else shrinks in significance. It calls the citizens of that city to invest their deepest hopes and affections, not in this transient world, but in their true eternal home.
It's so clear that City of God wasn't just a response to a crisis in the 5th century. Its ideas have had such a long reach.
An immense legacy. It has profoundly shaped Western thought, both politically and theologically, right down to our own time.
Politically, that framework of the two cities seems foundational.
Absolutely. It provided centuries of thinkers with a way to conceptualize the relationship, often fraught, between religious communities and secular authorities. It offered a rationale for the state's legitimate but limited role. Maintain temporal peace, restrain evil. It affirmed the state's authority as God-given, even while being realistic about its imperfections. And although the sources we focused on didn't detail just war theory as such, his discussions about the state's duty to maintain order and defend the innocent certainly laid crucial groundwork for later developments in that area.
And theologically, a cornerstone.
Without question. It shaped countless discussions on God's providence in history, on eschatology, the end times, and it solidified Western Christianity's understanding of original sin, human depravity, and the absolute necessity of God's grace for any true goodness or salvation. You see its influence across traditions, Catholic and Protestant alike.
It's amazing when you look at the list of thinkers influenced by him across the centuries. Descartes, Pascal, Newman, Chesterton, right up to contemporary philosophers like Alistair MacIntyre or Charles Taylor. These aren't just historical footnotes.
Not at all. His ideas are still alive, still debated, still challenging. City of God continues to force us to ask hard questions today. How should people of faith engage with political structures that often seem driven by self-interest, the earthly city? What's the right relationship between religious conviction and public life? Given Augustine's realism about earthly justice, what can we realistically hope to achieve through political action? How do we pursue peace, even temporary peace, in a world that seems perpetually driven by conflict?
And those deep theological questions too, free will and foreknowledge.
Still relevant. His argument that God's perfect foreknowledge doesn't negate human freedom, but rather perfectly knows the free choices we will make, continues to be explored. The relationship between soul and body, the nature of the resurrected life, these are perennial questions. The sheer scope of City of God ensures its ongoing relevance.
Okay, so let's try to wrap this up. Augustine's massive work, City of God, emerges from Rome's collapse, presenting this grand vision of two cities: the earthly city, driven by self-love, seeking temporary goods; the city of God, driven by love for God, seeking eternal peace.
He critiques paganism as empty and philosophy as limited without God's grace.
He offers a realistic view of the state necessary for earthly order, but inherently flawed due to sin, incapable of perfect justice.
And he places all human experience within this linear, God-guided story of salvation history, moving towards the final judgment and the ultimate glorious triumph of the City of God, all deeply informed by his understanding of original sin and the need for grace.
It's a framework that really forces you to reevaluate earthly power, success, history itself from an eternal perspective. It insists that our ultimate allegiance, our ultimate hope, is what truly defines us.
It challenges us to ask, what constitutes real happiness?
Right.
Where should our deepest trust lie?
And that really brings us to the final thought for you, the listener. In our world, still watching nations rise and fall, still wrestling with competing loyalties, still searching for justice and peace, how does Augustine's vision, these two cities built on two opposing loves, how does that challenge your understanding of society, of history, of what really matters in the end?
How does identifying with or seeking the City of God change how you live within and engage with the earthly city right now?
It really does make you examine your own loves, your own ultimate hopes.
16 centuries later, those questions Augustine raised feel as urgent as ever.
Maybe this deep dive has sparked something, perhaps even an interest in exploring the text itself. It's definitely a journey worth considering.